Hello and welcome to episode number 2 of this podcast. My name is Elliot Greenman and I host this with Alexi Enel. Alexi is an osteopath and he owns Euphoria Osteopaths in Tetbury, Gloucestershire. Last week we released our first episode, which was about pain and the course that we're trying to put together to help people better understand and manage chronic or persistent pain. This week's kind of a continuation from that. We talk a little bit more about osteopathy in general, the tenets of osteopathy and all the 3 rules. And we talk about expectations, 10 emotional needs, mental health, being a therapist and the challenges with that, whether it's a manual therapist or a psychotherapist. We talk about the Bible, religion, consciousness, and how all of that links in a little bit with pain, which was very interesting for me to learn. When I found out about it, I didn't realize that there was this big part of pain in the pain gate, which was all to do with stress and expectations. So yeah, that was very interesting for me. I hope you get some value from it too, and if you do, then please like, share, comment. We'd love to hear your feedback. If you've got any questions, if there are any parts of our podcast that you feel aren't very well explained, we would really love the opportunity to get your feedback on that and then revisit it. We'd love to answer that. I hope you enjoy this episode and
Perambulations in franglais.
So what is osteopathy?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what the osteopath does, apparently. So, which actually is a quite broad definition.
What does it mean? That's it.
So, osteo, everybody, and pathy. So everybody's gonna think that it's actually about bones, basically.
So that's what osteo means, right?
Yeah, osteo means in Latin. The main problem is that it's a Greek derivative, and it's osteon. And osteon is the root cause of things, in a way, okay? Rather than a bone from osteo. And pathy is pathology, or a bit the suffix of pathology. So the main thing, osteopath believes that pathology has got the root cause in musculoskeletal imbalance.
Musculoskeletal. What is pathology to begin with?
Pathology. So I don't know, like arthritis.
Okay.
You could have maybe.
It's basically the conditions like arthritis, sciatica, frozen shoulder.
Yes, that's it. But
physical issues with.
Well, that's it. Physical issue or a bit more really. So if your musculoskeletal system is really out of kilter in your mid-thoracic maybe, and you've got a little scoliotic pattern, and you've got a couple of ribs out, who supplies the nervous supply to the blood supply of your gallbladder, and maybe your liver a little, so maybe you'll be more likely to get gallstones type stuff. So there's a little bit of a direct link between certain pathologies. So people who've got COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, for example, like asthma, for example, we tend to think that part of it is really to do with how the musculoskeletal system is put together in terms of the structural part of it. So if they go some kind of kyphosis a little bit, so they've got an increased in their curve in their mid-back, for example, and the intercostals are not really working as well, and they've got extra tension in their diaphragm, so they work quite apically all of a sudden. In certain cases with the immune trigger, for example, like a dust or whatever else, the whole thing triggers asthma, for example. So osteopaths think or believe that pathology has got its root cause into the musculoskeletal system imbalance. Okay? But we need to extrapolate a bit with that, because a lot of it was is about the three main principles of it, really. So we say structure govern function.
Structure governs function.
Or function govern structure type thing. So the way the joint is put together enables it to go through a certain range of movement, for example. So your radial head is enabling, it turns at the whole elbow area, and it enables you to do pronation, supination. But because it's as well on the ball, it enables as well the whole hinging as well, which your ulna will do the same. And your olecranon, the tip of your elbow, when going against your humerus, you can't really extend further than that, basically. Okay. So there's the way the structure is put together, how the articulation or the joint is put together, enables a certain function. And if the joint has been used in a certain way, maybe like at the gym, for example, or occupationally speaking, and people really use only their biceps and the triceps is not really doing as much, well, people are going to change the way
the structure of their body.
By using them in a bit of a asymmetrical fashion. Okay.
Sometimes not for the better.
Yeah. Well, whatever. How it is. I think after it's a bit of a qualitative kind of. There's a quantitative, but a qualitative aspect of the whole thing, really. So some people, well, most of us are quite happy to bring things towards us. So that's quite fine, really, in a way. So. That's those things, really. So
that's, did you say that's the first principle?
Yeah, structure. Well, yeah, one of the three principles. Because we think we treat the body as a unit. And that's quite a bit all-encompassing thing. So when I say a lot of the time, I treat people suffering from low back pain. I treat people suffering from neck ache. I treat people suffering from asthma. I don't treat asthma as such. I don't treat low back pain. I treat the person suffering from the condition. Okay, and then we saw about that's why the pain gate is so interesting in terms of that. We can really look at that peripheral modulation, how we can affect a bit the skin, the muscle, the joint, and the organ. And then we need to look at the central modulation, at the expectation fulfillment theory of dream really fits nicely in terms of the stress and how expectation when unfulfilled tend to really lead to a heightened level of stress, really heightened level of adrenaline, potentially on the short term, and a bit like exhaustion of your adrenal gland, which leads to a slight decrease in your cortisol level, which actually leads to more inflammation and things like that. Okay,
and
so
leads or I don't know whether the constant use of cortisol and constant use of your adrenal gland leads to like chronic fatigue, but the unmanaged expectations can lead to chronic fatigue if you find yourself in way too much REM sleep as opposed to
that's it. So that's where the expectation fulfillment theory of dream is on about, really. You are going to be able to act upon the expectation you just opened physically in your everyday life with your body, using your body, so your motivation, and you get the dopamine, and then you get reward with your endorphins, and that stabilizes your mood with serotonin type stuff. Okay, but if you can't actually fulfill the expectation in a day, you've got a really great tool, which is your REM sleep, basically your REM sleep, where you're gonna act. Your brain acts on the expectation in a metaphorical fashion, so it's like a theater type stuff. It's like
an abstraction of
the expectation, basically. Okay, and that's actually gonna sap a bit your motivation. So that's gonna be dopamine thirsty. It is gonna really demand quite a lot of dopamine. So
what, in REM sleep?
In REM sleep, yeah. Oh. So you need to be quite motivated during your REM sleep in your dream. That's it. So you need
to be mentally motivated.
Yeah.
It uses mental motivation.
That's it.
To REM sleep.
That's it. to be able to fulfill those expectations in a metaphorical fashion, in a theater.
So it's like if you know that you're going through a period of dreaming loads,
yeah,
and then you wonder why you're fatigued and not motivated and stuff.
Well, first thing in the morning. So we see that with adolescents who tend to really indulge in sleep quite a lot, and they are going through quite a lot. So we think about growth spur.
It's kind of like
no problem.
like fibromyalgia, people with that.
So that's one way of actually approaching the whole problem, basically. And I think that's quite... so yeah, fibromyalgia people, and then the little video we made about it on the website is really about that, really. So it's people who tend to have quite high expectation, and they tend to be high functioning people. So they tend to really do an awful lot at work, with hobbies, with friends, in the community. They are very involved, but they got quite a high spec of expectation, which actually, as long as they function and they manage to really fulfill them, is absolutely not a problem. And until they got like a virus or an infection, or they break their leg and they are poorly and they are not able to actually go and do their hobbies, they withdraw a little bit from work maybe, or things like that, because they've got like 2 or 3 weeks of work, because they are really pretty poorly, because they are really physically involved as well, and they start to use their REM, so they tend to increase the demand on REM phase, basically, to the detriment of the slow wave sleep. So the slow wave sleep is enabling you to actually repair yourself. So it's like the body sleep. And the REM is a mind sleep type thing. Okay.
Which, if you're quite high functioning and you, not that always means that they're going to exercise, but it probably means that they're going to do some sort of exercise.
Exactly.
They need that deep sleep, maybe a little bit more.
More, exactly, in order to keep the whole thing in balance quite nicely. And then all of a sudden the whole thing capsizes a bit, and then to be able to fulfill their expectation, they are and their high level of expectation, they are pushing the REM package a little bit, which takes a bit more space for the amount of sleep they got. And then all of a sudden they start to, because they are a bit less active, they start to be able to sleep a little bit more, and during that sleep they tend to actually act on their expectation in the REM. They don't do as much low wave sleep, and then they tend to be even less motivated, so they tend to be fatigued. I think that's where the term fatigued is a little bit peculiar. They are not as motivated in a way. They're aching everywhere. So because they are not repairing very well or they are not recovering from the infection quite well.
So they are fatigued because they are physically fatigued. But it's more than that.
And they are mentally not very motivated. Fatigued.
Well.
Fatigued inverted bracket.
It's a bit of a normalization.
That's it. But that's really interesting way of looking at the whole thing, because and for an osteopath to have that understanding of your patient and what he's going through in his life and the emotional stress he's under, and having a model that is actually quite straightforward, very rational, like that sequence of 10 needs, and the way the whole physiology, neurophysiology is happening, and how the mind affects the body, and the body affects the mind, basically. So you twist your ankle, and as all that persistent pain we're talking about, you twist your ankle, you can't go to exercise, and somehow you're not able to fulfill some of the expectations that the exercise gives you, like meeting other people, being part of a group, having meaningful relationship with other people, having the attention a little bit, you've got your competence, and it's quite all encompassing in a way, and the control you've got of it, all those kind of stuff really, and the status possibly. So it's going to affect like already six of the needs really.
It's going to knock a load of them out, and if that's the only place you're getting some of those things like community, and potentially if you're part of a club, like working for something bigger than yourself, then it can be one massive hit all at once.
Exactly. So it's one string to your bow instead of having several strings to your bow to manage your stress really. Okay. And that's really I don't know, I think there was there possibly was a few bits and bobs like that before, in terms of in the 17th or 18th century, some of the higher class people, higher economic class people were a little bit in that. In France, we call that the spleen, a little bit le spleen. And then these people who
What
were,
does that mean, le spleen?
they were very, well, they were quite poorly people all the time because they were not very motivated, no joie de vivre, all those kind of things really. And I think they could have been suffering some.
What does joie de vivre mean again?
So like how you enjoy your life, a little.
Oh,
How much enjoyment you get out of life, basically. Joie de vivre. No. So yeah, so it's not maybe a new thing, but it's a bit more kind of the 21st century type thing, and it's a very functional thing. People are under and north. I don't know. Like I look at my grandmother, bless her soul, who. You know, she died in her late 90s, and her life was pretty straightforward, really. There was no... She was married, she was doing the cooking, she was looking after her daughter, she was polishing her husband's shoes. Not to say that it's a way of going, but her expectations were pretty set, and the level of them were actually quite easily fulfilled and met.
This is something I was going to ask you, because it's like, from listening to Jordan Peterson and some man like Gary Vaynerchuk and some of these other like inspirational people, certainly to like, I guess, my generation, they all talk about like patience and empathy and like as two massive commodities, and two of the things that very few people seem to possess. And I think about it a lot with regards to unmanaged expectations and stress and pain and stuff. And it's like they always say in your 20s, or like especially in your 20s, just figure out how much you're able to work. Try and learn something from someone and learn it really, really well, but don't try and rush it and think that you're going to learn it really well in a year. Take your time to build that skill, blah, 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 blah. And although I've never heard them talk with relation to unmanaged or unfulfilled expectations or indeed any other, like they mention control and maybe some of the other emotional needs sometimes, but I don't think it's on purpose with regards to the human givens or those emotional needs. But it's like, it makes so much sense, because it's if my expectations of playing piano are, if I can bring them right down, and then all of a sudden I'm going to be able to meet those expectations a lot easier.
But you need to be a bit cautious there, because you don't want to really. We're not saying that we need to bring our expectation right down. We are saying we need to have a level of expectation that is manageable.
Yeah, of course.
That's the thing. So let's not dampen things.
Somewhere in between.
That's it.
Really, really low.
That's
and
it.
Somewhere that's you find that balance to be able to push yourself.
That's it. It needs to be stretched.
Part of it, because it's like
it's to be stretched rather than to be stressed, in a way, really.
Yeah, because but by very nature of the emotional needs, with something like playing an instrument, it's a really good example, because the different emotional needs within that like stretch each other, because it's like unless you have absolutely no competence expectations of yourself and you just want to sit and hit something, in which case then maybe that isn't going to fulfill you.
Contemporary art or modern art type thing. You just take a piano, you've never done it, and then you make some noise and you call it music, really. Yes, and then your competence is really high. Maybe you're a bit narcissistic as well, and you've got a bit of some problem like that. But I think it's quite an interesting thing generationally, and it's the whole mastery. And you want to do an apprenticeship, for example. Well, if you want to be a farrier or a blacksmith, and you want to shoe horses, for example, well, it's going to take you 5 years to really follow somebody and get the craftsmanship and then the diligence of turning up every day and really doing it again and again and again until you do it almost with your eyes closed, really.
It's that 10,000 hours thing.
Kind of thing, 10,000 or a bit more. So it can be 100,000 in cases, really. So, and then all trades of, so you go to university university, you've got your 3-year degree, or even your master's, or and a PhD, and thing, and then you've been in your head quite a lot, really. And mostly, really. And then, so if you've studied, I don't know, like politics or something like that, and thing, well, you're not going to have acted upon it physically, in a way. So it meets some of the needs, but they are not met really physically. Oh yeah, you might have gone to conferences, you might have gone to courses, you might have...
But it's still very different.
It's still very different than, I don't know, be a tiler or a roofer or people who do thatch roofing, for example. All the different things, the little things that you're going to develop for yourself. You're going to leave a little cachet of approval on your work, really, which is really unique to yourself as well. All those things, so stonemason, all that kind of things. They used to, like when they were building cathedrals, all those kind of things, they were using their own little symbol on all the stones, a bit pagan and things like that, and they were going around France, for example, and they would really craft they were crafty people, really. Compared to nowadays, leave their mark literally. And nowadays, I think sometimes a lot of it there's a bit too high expectation for something that is not super practical in a way, really. Which, not to say it's good or bad.
So masonry as an example.
As an example, yeah, that's it.
But crafts are just changing, aren't they?
That's it.
That's again another thing to do with expectations.
That's it.
Itself. As a community, as a
community species,
or as a community in the UK or in Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, sorry.
That's it.
And then as a species as well.
That's it.
It's like things are changing, but because people have, and that's like because they have like an expectation of how they used to be.
That's it. So especially women a little bit, and then since the 60s with all the contraceptive pill, and then the emancipation of women, and the fact that they've raised quite a lot their expectation of what they could do. And the example of my grandma, it was pretty simple, and then and then not to say that it was not fulfilling really for her really, but my mom would not have done that for anything. My dad had to actually polish his own shoes, really, type stuff. There were things there was no way, and a lot of women will have their men to iron their own shirt and say like that, really, because they want to do other things and they want to try to fulfill themselves as well as individuals, as human beings, as business women, and I don't know, like there's an awful lot really, but it raises the stake basically, and it brings a bit the level of expectation quite high, and therefore it's spinning plates really. When you spin the one plate, yes, it's not really super challenging, but when you start to spin 10 plates, well, you have to really be...
You have to be very good at spinning plates.
You have to be very good at spinning plates. And then after, all of a sudden, as soon as there's one plate to start to wobble and fall, well, often a lot is difficult, not for the whole thing to capsize a bit completely. And the patience, humility, all those kind of things are very, very important, really. So you get married, and then after a year, oh, well, I don't love you anymore, let's break up, that thing, really. It's a bit, well, yeah, of course, we have different people a year down the line, and it's something to work on, really. It's not...
People change at different, not, I hate the word rates, because it makes you feel like one's quicker than the other, but it's they just
differently,
different paces.
Differently, different direction, and things sometimes. So when we see quite a lot of the time, like transformational work, a little. So the husband is an accountant and he wants to become a bit of a psychotherapist, for example. He wants to change career, so he's going to meet new people, all those kind of stuff, and then his view of the world is going to actually change, and therefore his spouse is going to be left a little bit on
maybe she's done something different as well,
and that's it. You know, which actually takes them a bit apart instead of trying to work it to try to go together. But it's something that you have to craft again, really. So relationships are a very good example like that. They have to be crafted, and you need to be patient, really, with them.
And I always think about I think about certain people who I know who are in a relationship or married and then been divorced and married again, blah blah blah, and I often think that people will get into a relationship or a marriage or have kids, like those three big things, without thinking about what they actually want from life, and then later on in life when things are a little bit settled down or the kids are much more independent and less reliant on them, and all of a sudden in that situation that means that some of their emotional needs have changed because their kids all of a sudden doing their own thing.
And to be a parent, it's to put your emotional needs second anyway. So you put
you have to fulfill the needs of
your kids first, really.
That's what I mean. So those emotional needs, all of a sudden now they're taking your kids 18, 21
takes priority.
Whatever, they're able to. You're still guiding them, of course, but it's not taking up loads of your life. And then I think that people then start to think about what they want it to be and what maybe they want to try and be that thing now. Say mid-40s, it's like midlife crisis. Like I always think about it. It's like, and then they start trying to fulfill it with random stuff. Generally, doing what we all do and buy stuff that we think is going to fill the hole, and then. That doesn't work, midlife crisis, and then they end up, things start breaking down, and then they try and pursue something, and then also a lot of people think it's too late, and they're like 40s and 50s, which I don't think is the case nowadays. Maybe it used to be, but yeah.
But they are stressed, that stresses them, and they end up at a manual therapist because they've got a bad shoulder or bad back, and that's really bringing a bit the whole picture and trying to really treat people as a unit, and or thinking of people as a unit and a mind-body type unit. I think is very, or even spiritual part, but I think mind-body is already quite all-encompassing, and whole aspiration for something greater than you and everything is quite an interesting thing as well. But that's it really. So the structure and the function are interrelated. The people are or patients or the public or all of us are a bit seen by the osteopath as a whole, as a unit, a bit greater than the sum of its part. And then we've got the rule of the artery is supreme, and that's where it starts to be quite interesting.
The first one was structural function.
Yeah, structural function, or the
one of the three.
Function.
The second one was you see the community.
No. The person as a unit.
The person as a unit,
mind body, and then the rule of the artery is supreme.
What do you mean by that? Because it's the is it the rule? The rule.
Rule. R-U-L-E.
Yeah, as in the rule. Yeah. The rule. What does that mean? You've said that so many times.
So basically, you're 70% water. You're fluid, basically, and you need for your tissue to be perfused by oxygenated blood and nutrient-rich blood, and that perfusion is going to lead to two byproducts, which is going to be your venous blood and your lymphatic system. Okay, so you've got like high pressure, you've got low pressure fluid, you've got the interstitial fluid, and you've got the intracellular fluid, and you've got the cerebrospinal fluid. So you got plenty of
fluid in everything.
Fluid in everything within the cell, around the cell, within
veins,
the veins, the artery. The artery needs to be supplied by an artery in order to be fed, and
the
vein
needs to be supplied by an artery.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Vasorum.
Just having a science lesson.
Vasorum. Yes, that is it. Well, yes, it is.
Which one's bigger? But no, wait. One goes away and one goes.
Well, it depends. One goes towards the heart and one goes away from the heart.
One vein or one artery?
Well, the artery goes away from the heart, and the vein goes towards the heart.
That's what. Yeah.
Okay, and bizarrely, because we can't say about oxygenated blood and desoxygenated blood. Okay, so the artery goes away from the heart, and the vein goes towards the heart. Because there's a cardiopulmonary system, and then the peripheral arterial system and venous system. Okay, so it's not going to be the same really. Because the artery who's bringing the desoxygenated blood to your lung is desoxygenated blood. So to your lung, and the lung is going to reoxygenate it and bring it back to the heart via vein. So the oxygenated blood on the cardiopulmonary system is traveling in the vein. Okay, compared to in your body, the blood coming back to your heart is traveling in the vein and is actually desoxygenated or less oxygenated. That's okay. Anyway, regardless of that, so
the rule of the
artery is supreme, and that's where we go back to that structure govern function a little bit. So and we talk about the expectation and the stress. And the stress response. So a very important thing is the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so we got the sympathetic nervous system and we've got the parasympathetic nervous system.
The sympathetic nervous system is the autonomic.
Yes, and the parasympathetic is the autonomic as well.
Oh right.
Yeah. So both are. So it's like driving a fast car, and then you got the throttle, which would be the sympathetic nervous system, and you got the brake, which would be like the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, that's quite a good analogy with that, really.
Why?
And that's actually a nervous system that mediates the mobility of the blood depending on the demand. So let's say you're having a hog roast type thing, and you're around the whole table, the blood is going to go away from your musculoskeletal system into your gut because it's digestive type thing. So that's it, rest and digest. So
that happens from us just smelling and
seeing and then preparing your food, all those kind of stuff type thing, really. So you tend to your autonomic nervous system tend to actually relatively deprive your musculoskeletal system of blood and increase the pool of blood into your gut. Okay, so it's going to constrict certain blood vessels and dilate others.
So it's probably that's why it's a good idea not to be walking around and eating and like doing stuff. And
that's it.
Sit down,
or jumping into very cold water when you've been in the sun for a while and after whilst digesting. And then those kind of hydrocution, all those kind of stuff is an autonomic nervous system kind of shock type thing. Okay. So, and that's the rest and digest, and the flight and fright, it's dilating your bronchi, increasing your heart rate, you getting rid of the whole saliva. So when you're really super stressed and scared, all of a sudden, your mouth is a bit dry, all those kind of things, because you're not going to digest, you're not going to be eating, and you need all that, your salivary gland is being deprived of blood supply as well, and your muscles start to dilate the blood vessel, you're able to sweat and lose some heat, all those kind of things, really, okay? And often you got that decrease in the perfusion of your gut, which actually gives you that stomach sensation. So adrenal junkies, people who base jumps and all those kind of things, they love it. They love how it feels. They love the sensation, the body sensation there is. I get at the top of a ladder and I get the sensation because I'm a bit and I go against the wall, I put my tongue to get more adhesion, but my mouth is dry and it's not really happening. And I can't stand how it goes, really. So I'll be more passing out from that kind of thing.
Sure.
So I'll freeze, basically.
Yeah.
So that would be my response.
Is that your sympathetic nervous system?
Sympathetic nervous system
is the parasympathetic.
Is for the digestion.
But you can change that, right?
That's it. You can control it. You can control it more than a little bit. Especially there's plenty of techniques, but mostly we like to use our abdominal diaphragm.
So breathing.
And whole 7-11 breathing technique. So that abdominal breathing. But you get plenty of ways to actually do it, but that's the preferred one we like, or at Euphoria or as an osteopath, or that's the one I quite enjoy doing because that's really quite an easy one to actually do, basically.
What is 7-11 breathing?
You breathe in a count of 7 into your abdomen. So you actually push your abdomen out as you breathe in, and you tend to try to control your out breath for the count of 11. It can be 3.5, 5.5, or it can be 3.5. It doesn't have to be 7-11. You need to breathe a little longer than you breathe. You need to breathe longer out than you breathe.
Which is kind of similar to the Wim Hof method, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Except he holds his breath on the out breath.
On the out breath, which actually increases. So actually, he's working a little bit on CO2 level into your blood as well. Okay.
So that's why it's boosting the oxygen level.
No, it's boosting a bit the CO2 level. When you hold your breath, you tend to because it's been increasing his Wim Hof does it in a certain fashion.
But you were saying with the breathing before, which I found interesting, and I can't get the image out of my head of like massaging your organs, and it probably not being a good idea for you to start doing that. But with breathing, your organs will
be massaged nicely, and then they get more perfused because you apply the brake on that autonomic nervous system, and musculoskeletal system gets a bit relatively deprived of blood, and then you get a bit more blood into your gut. So all those kind of stuff, walking, where we are a bit too sedentary, when you walk and then you breathe, you kind of have a bit of a cadence between some of the contraction of some of the musculoskeletal system muscle, and then you've got a bit of a pumping of your diaphragm, who tends to really massage things. So your large intestine, for example, your kidney, all sorts of things really. So that's, and then the blood supply tends to be rushing around and things really. Okay, so yeah.
So the three principles.
Yeah.
Structure and function
are interrelated.
Interrelated.
Yeah.
The person as a whole.
Yeah, the body is a unit, but actually we like to think that the person in front of you has that mind-body type thing, and that the expectation fulfillment theory of dream fits really perfectly. So you got a very good understanding of, because people don't come only with a bad bag, they come with all their personal lives, their hobby, exactly, that's it. We ask about hobbies, because you play football and you like Paris Saint-Germain, his team is great, but it's not really what it's all about. It's that gregarious thing, the sense of community, the meaningful relationship with other people, the status that it gives you, all those kind of stuff. So the whole underlying type needs.
The things that we don't ever really think about consciously.
Yes, that's it. But we do it nonetheless for those kind of reasons. We're quite gregarious.
We're naturally drawn to it, which is why those emotional needs are like relatively. They're not far off the same across loads of.
Yeah, exactly. So
it's like therapy models.
Yeah. So we talk about archetypal needs. We talk about whether you're an Inuit on the ice sheet of the North Pole, or you're a Saramacca in the Amazon River basin, and or you're a Pygmy, or you're a Mongol in Ulaanbaatar. It's exactly the same. We are all drawn towards those 10 needs, and it's quite an important aspect of people to a different degree for different culture and the whole thing. But we talk about Westerners quite a lot that we treat, and it's definitely a very great model.
And it seems, I was talking to someone earlier with CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah. She's had it for a very long time, I think. I don't really know her that well, and she's also got some pain. She actually lives nearby and might come see you. But she was saying it's really confusing as to why, and I know lots of other people have said this, it's confusing as to why there's so many more people in pain. It seems like more and more people are in pain, and then more and more people are suffering with depression, or more and more people suffering with blah 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 blah. All of the lots of things that are linked. In fact,
we talk about mental health. There's a lot about mental health problem. We talk about all those kind of stuff, but I don't think mental health is a problem. I don't think pain is a problem. I don't think anything is a problem. The problem is people don't know how to manage it. It's the management of it.
Yeah.
So it's our understanding of it. Not that there was much understanding of it before, actually. But I think the level of expectation was pretty lower. It was lower, and therefore there were far less people in those predicaments because of that.
Maybe the level of expectation was lower, but maybe it was just different, which is probably what it was. Because it's like, you know, if you had to hunt for food, you had to do things that way, then your competence and all of these other things and status and stuff like that.
But you would not do it on your own. You will do it with other people, and you will actually act upon it.
But
so you'll burn.
You have to. That's my point. You've got a really good driver, really, really strong motivator.
That's it. Dopamine.
And also the amount of things that you can do, the amount of expectations that you can have of yourself. Whilst you're getting your basic food and water needs met, and using, you know, hunting or whatever to fulfill those needs.
And shelter.
Nowadays, we've got like I was saying to this girl earlier, and I'm not sure if it's right or not, but I think like life's so good and it's so comfortable now that all of these things are starting to come out, and they're starting to come out really quick because whilst life's really comfortable and you know, health's better than ever, blah 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 blah, it looks like loads of comfort and everything that we want might not actually be what our body needs.
But I think a need for shelter is a quite a real need. It's a real, a very concrete, a very palpable, a very how do we say that? Real.
Of course.
For a lack of a better word. But the expectation of how much control you have is very different, because actually it's how much control you think you have in comparison to how much control you really have. So we're talking about something that doesn't really exist.
That's what I mean.
Okay?
It's like
so we're getting stressed nowadays about things that don't really exist in a way, really. Okay?
But we don't get a reminder of that. So the way everything's so comfortable, like
we get a very good reminder of that. We are in pain. We've got mental health
problem.
Get
a literal reminder of that. That was my point. It's like I think in previous cultures and civilizations, and maybe still some that exist today, they get a very literal reminder of their their status, or maybe their control, but other things like attention and competence and things like that every single day. And I always think about so my brother's an electrician, and he's really good electrician, but he's also a very hard worker. So he's very good at his job, but he's very good at doing his job. And he gets some very good feedback, like usually on a daily, if not bi-weekly or weekly basis, feedback of his job. He gets to sit back and look at how competent he is and get a bit of attention from the customer, then get a bit of financial security, blah 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 blah. But then there's other jobs like I think there's like marketing or something, or maybe politics, where it's like you might be really good at your job, but the payback time, or I don't know the word for it.
The feedback
is like, it's like really spread out, and sometimes you can get to that feedback point, and then there's so many variables, as there will be naturally over when you draw that period out, then it has to change, and your original goal is no longer the thing that is actually going to be met. So then you're on a different course, and so it's like, it's actually, I think, whilst we have an indicator of pain, which although you say that's a really good indicator, and I definitely agree, nearly no one I've spoken to, even though they've been told they've got chronic pain, none of them have ever said it's something, it's an indicator to me. So
it's a negative, so that's a dead end. That's the whole thing. It's a dead end. But the main thing, they've been speaking to people who are trying to meet their needs as well, instead of trying to help their, so like when you talk about the medical profession, or people who tend to have high skills, who've been trained for a long time, who tend to have a high income, a high status, worth a job, a level of competence, all those kind of things, they end up being quite greedy for those kind of things for themselves. Not all of them, but most of them.
It's quite natural. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Right?
A little bit, and then the practitioner, let's say it like that, however the practitioner is not very aware directly in a concrete fashion or in a practical fashion of how much he uses his client as a mean to actually fulfill his needs. And when you're an electrician, it's quite interesting, but when you're a general practitioner or an osteopath or a psychotherapist, you've got a big glitch because you're actually using your patient to meet your need. In a way, instead of helping your patient to meet his need,
and it's
in
more,
a way,
it's
okay?
more of a those practitioners, industries, blah blah blah, careers are more qualitative rather than quantitative. As an electrician. So an electrician, it's like if you get something wrong, you can test it, and your system is very, very well set up. That's it. You know you've got something wrong. Whereas when you're being a psychotherapist, as you say, there's so many ways to do it, and
the well-being of your patient is how you quantify and qualify a little bit the feedback you get from your patients.
And there's no control. It's like there's no control to draw back to.
That's it.
As in, whereas when you're rewiring a house and then you flip the switch and nothing happens, it's like, okay, well the control is not the level state.
That's it, because you deal with the most complex structure in a known universe at this stage, which is the human body, really, or the human person, in a way. The human person is the most complex structure, or the most complicated structure, in a way, okay?
And then going back to your osteopathic, your 3 principles, I guess, it's like not only is the human body complicated structure, but it's also part of a community which is even like it's unbelievably complex.
That's it, and culturally and things like that. So all the different frameworks we've got in order to be able to work around that are quite it's more than complicated in a way, really. And yes, of course, you want to be able to have feedback. We've got continual professional development. We've got governing bodies who are giving a bit of a framework of what the profession should be like on average a little, and then how is it going on the bell curve a little bit. So one part of the bell curve is chop to try to really keep the whole thing towards the median part, really, and another part has got a little bit of leeway to try to explore a little bit what the profession can do, and new discoveries, new modalities of treatment, new ways to integrate things, which is a bit what we want to do a little bit, or what I'd like to do in my practice in a way, really, and trying to be a bit quite humanistic and patient-centered as much as possible, basically. And the experience my patient are having is what it's all about, in a way. And yes, of course, like being a parent, really, my children's experience is feeding my needs, but I'm putting everything in place for them to be able to meet their needs, and by doing so, that feeds me in a way. That's the whole thing, really. I don't find it as a detriment to myself, really.
That has to be why we have the community. One of our emotional needs is to be part of a community, and then another one is to work for something bigger than yourself, and the two are often very closely linked,
maybe.
As they all are, but it's like that must be why we've always had that need, and whether it's through a historical tribe or even a religion or something, it's like community has always been really important, because
we should ask Jordan Peterson about the whole thing about the creation of a religion and how it goes about from all that, really, in a way, really, and the whole community, and where the community starts and where the community and the religion starts, and then how is it the whole thing evolves a little bit, really. But a lot of it is that non-palpable sub framework about it really, and I think the emotional needs are very important, and the REM and the metaphorical representation we have is enabling us to kind of emulate our human condition and have some kind of aspiration for something a bit greater than us all the time really. And after it's been completely corrupted by us in order to go back to the first three needs, which is to do control, security, safety and status. That's the main thing. It's the churches or it's the institution who's not real, who's human-led and human-centered
so
in a way really.
Is that the idea of religion becoming westernized? Because I spoke to someone a while back who was studying cancer, and he said he was religious, but he said like he's religious by knowledge, not religious by tradition. But he also said that he would call himself, he is a Muslim. He said, I am a Muslim. And the way he spoke about it was more of I am of Muslim people. I am from I'm a race basically, or
culture.
Lost
the track.
Lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, and he was saying like the literal interpretation of the Bible, the literal interpretation of the Quran, where it's like talk about jihad, or with the Bible it's like hate gays and stuff like that. So that was, he was saying that's like a very much a westernized like opinion or view on the Bible, whereas the abstractions or metaphors within the Bible, which are the things that which Jordan Peterson talks about and focus on a little bit more. So,
to name only one person, because I think a lot of people are talking about all that really, and the main thing is your metaphor, the aspiration you have, that really special thing of the pattern of behavior will become the rule. So you need to be able to observe it, and you need to be able to have the mental capacity to be able to word it in a way and reflect on it.
Yeah, but just
the lobster and the whole thing. So we talk about the serotonin circuitry in a lobster. There's one dominant one, and there's a dominated one. And for the dominated one to have some kind of something to do, otherwise he doesn't have the chicks. He just have to eat and shit. It's a bit useless kind of thing. Well, there's that serotonin thing who's making him quite happy to be in that situation. So the whole hierarchy and the way the whole thing is stratified, and the dominance, the hierarchy of dominance, is actually I don't know, it's 300 million a year, something like that, really, because it's an arthropod, so it's quite old kind of thing, and there's a pattern of behavior that is there. But the lobster is not able to write it down, or is not able to make a drawing out of it. He's not able to actually speak to others about, it's great to be the one dominating, and your serotonin is really that thing. He doesn't have the mental capacity and the ability to abstract on a whole lot. And that's why we talk about in the human givens, is to be conscious of being conscious. You're able to kind of look at yourself being conscious. Yeah. You're able to be conscious of being conscious, which happens, we think, and it's quite very interesting stuff. I've been really quite interesting about cave painting and Neolithic cave painting there's quite a lot in France, in Spain, and things, but all of a sudden, and then a bit like all the way humankind has spread from Africa and then migrates everywhere and things. Well, actually 40,000 years ago-ish, maybe 50 or maybe 40,000 years ago on average, everywhere on Earth, there's some kind of spark of the Homo sapiens becomes Homo sapiens sapiens, and you can see hieroglyphic representation, abstraction of thoughts made in a pictorial fashion.
This is going back in history, right?
Yeah, 40,000 years ago. Yeah, roughly. So Chauvet, For example, you see the lion in Chauvet, it's a manga. The whole thing moves, there's movement in it, the way it's represented is like, the guy was like a completely, I don't know, like an artist. And I think when even, Pablo Picasso went to Lascaux cave, he said, well, we've not really invented much in terms of art for the last 40,000 years, really, or 30,000 years, that thing, really. It was just completely, the way the whole thing is represented is absolutely amazing, and is that ability to be conscious of being conscious and abstracting the whole lot. And I think that's where that deity and something a bit greater than you are able to make sense of why is it we're here, really.
Because we're conscious of being conscious.
Like to buy some shit that you don't need. Like that's quite a bit of there's a bit of something missing, a little bit, really. If you get up in the morning just to pay your mortgage and buy some blue paper and just go to shit and then sleep, wow, that's we miss quite a lot, really.
The newest trainers and stuff.
Yeah, newest trainer, exactly. To look at the GDP, to look at the whole lot, and I think that's where we get a bit stuck with that climate change or global warming, and if we don't believe in it, however, how much joie de vivre has everybody got? That's the thing, really. How much enjoyment have you got in your life, really? And there is an aspiration for something a bit greater than you, and the abstraction of things that is enabling you to realize how much more fulfilling things can be, really. And I think that's that whole thrust which is completely lost in a way, really. That's a bit the problem in many people, really. And we see with Daesh, for example, and we get a new caliphate in a place where there was a caliphate before, because we dismantled the caliphate on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the Treaty of Versailles, and Peugeot Sykes line. We cut a bit the whole lot and created all the Lebanon, Syria, Sinai, the whole thing, and Ottoman Empire which was a caliphate. That's it, really. And then some new people come along, and there's a bit of a vacuum which we created, and then there's something, and they rally people behind something a bit greater than them, basically. And you can indoctrinate people, you can brainwash them much more easily, and things like that. And it's all about control, all about status, about things. So it's a complete parody of a caliphate. Really.
It's about the main problem. Thing, but they prey on working for something bigger than yourself and people's
pretending
absence.
Pretending to,
of course. But people's absence of working for something bigger than themselves and absence of community. That's it. Then all of a sudden, it's like the flat Earth theory.
That's
all
it.
Of a sudden, and I mean, in the case of the flat Earth theory, it's like,
they don't kill anybody.
That's fine.
They don't kill anybody, and the experience you have in the middle of a field is you're below a dome, and then you dig, there's a bit of water, and then you walk a bit along, there's some water as well, so you're surrounded by water, there's water under you, and then a whole lot, and then you see the sun and the stuff turning around you, and that's it, really. So why not, really? And as long as you don't shove it down everybody's throat and you're not proselytic, the main problem is to have a problem about it, really. I've got the same experience as them every day, and it doesn't prevent me from having to go to the mall and buy some shit and that I don't need, all those kind of stuff, really. That's the whole thing. It's just that if that's what it takes you to be able to be part of a community, having meaningful relationship with others, and having that, I think the main issue with that is the whole conspiracy theory. There's somebody not telling you something, when actually it's just your brain and your perception of it, and the fact that you're quite limited in your perception. It's just a perceptual warp. Yeah. That's it, really. So it's great.
You talk about
no problem.
being conscious of being conscious.
Yeah. Sapiens. Homo sapiens sapiens.
So like.
Or sapiens.
What, I don't know what that. So it's like how. With Joe Griffin and Ivan Tyrrell with the human Gewins, and mainly with Joe Griffin and the expectation fulfillment theory of dream, he talks about mammalian behaviour and mammals dreaming, right?
Yeah.
And I'm confused as to why they have REM sleep.
Yes, that's it.
And like I said to you, like a girl said to me a while back about dolphins being surely they're conscious of being conscious. And I think I understand it, but I definitely don't understand
potentially, but it's difficult to communicate it with them, and it's difficult to see the abstraction they make out of the whole thing.
From being conscious.
From being conscious or being conscious. They've not made art quite yet, and art is made, and music, but maybe they actually are quite musical with their sonars and things like that, and maybe we don't understand it as much. But REM sleep in ondotocet, the tooth well, is quite an interesting thing because it's monocephalic and possibly multiphasic type thing. So,
can you explain those two words again?
So bicephalic, so they monocephalic. So we've got two hemispheres, and to prevent the dolphin from actually
right and left,
that's it. To prevent the dolphin from actually drowning, he needs to be able to sleep with only one of his brain, not the two, in a way. Okay. So that's only one side of his brain at the time, and then after he might sleep several times in a day. He doesn't sleep between 11 to 7 in the morning. There's lots of people on Earth, in all like the Greeks, for example, or Greek culture. Even currently, you go to Crete. In the summer, it's 45 degrees in the shade at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, while you go for a little siesta after lunch. You're not missing too much, really, in a way, really. And therefore, you can be a bit active a bit longer in the evening, and you might sleep a bit less at night, really, in a way. So you've got a biphasic type of sleep. Okay?
Whereas we generally in the UK have monophasic.
People want to have a monophasic type thing. You go to work in a monophasic fashion as well. You can't really work in the morning, have a big break, and then work a bit. So you have to sleep in the same thing. It's a bit too regimented in a way, really. But
maybe it might work really well.
The other part, I think my understanding of it, and I don't think I've got as good an understanding of Joe Griffin about the whole subject, and far from that, but my understanding of it is the REM is as well, in mammals, having a rehearsal of some of the pattern of behaviors. As well.
Yeah.
So some of the reflexes and some of the expression of your genes is having to be rehearsed within your sleep to try to keep them alive in a way. Okay? So on top of the expectation fulfillment, which is for maybe humans, Homo sapiens sapiens.
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm not entirely sure how much abstract representation, because I'm not a scientist like a dolphin or cetaceous scientist, but the main thing with humans, we've got representation, the graphical type thing, the drawings, the whole music, all those kind of things that we kind of extrapolate, and we make a metaphorical representation of our thought process in a way. So we use REM to be able to fulfill those expectations, and we are doing it as well to rehearse some of the patterns of behavior. So it's all that. So it's really quite an interesting thing, but it's all your amygdala, all the algorithms, let's call them. So your hypothalamus, your thalamus, your hippocampus, all that reptilian brain that we like to call is having things. So your thermoregulation, thank God he's not really very conscious, and it's been done in an automatic fashion, but he has to be maintained. He has to be, you need to service it.
Yeah.
You need to service it. And your REM is possibly, my understanding, maybe I'm completely wrong, and it would be quite good to have a bit of more thing about that, but some of your breathing, some of your, how you like, so Joe talks a lot about autism and the fact that some of the autistic kids really enjoy being in the water, so they tend to regress a little bit of there's a complexification of those patterns of behaviors. In a way, in order to be human, in a way. And then the autistic kind of thing, there is a bit of a regression, and you become more like a fish type thing. So because we are fish at one stage, we are like a unicellular thing for not too long, really. So we do all the evolution. We replay all the evolution and all the pattern of behaviors throughout our embryogenesis and fetal life and childhood potentially. Really, okay. So it's
that idea of regression. Is that
maybe not regression.
Well,
in that sense. Okay, but
well, actually, I'm going to stay with it because
yeah.
Or the idea of you saying like regression. I know you didn't mean it, but like.
Going back.
Is that essentially like being in a part of the brain that potentially developed more at that
that point of being a fish? Yeah.
Because it's like reptilian brain. I don't really.
Reptilian or like Well, yeah. So let's call it archaic brain type thing. So there's a neocortex. The new cortex, the new brain, in a way, okay? So we can see with fossils and all those kind of stuff, the way the neocortex develops a little bit and all those kind of things, really. So embryologically speaking, really. So the REM in mammals is enabling them to service and to try to keep alive or keep active some of the pattern of behaviors, in a way, okay? And after, the pattern matching is a very interesting subject again in terms of with pain and in terms of all those kind of things. Really, a lot of the things we do all the time are not. So after we're talking about being free, having free will, and I was arguing that maybe freer will, because there's no free will. We so completely engrossed in those kind of patterns of behavior, we can't really change them. Really, you can't. Maybe we can have access, and I'm pretty sure some monks in the Himalayas, in a grotto and things like that, is able to change his thermoregulation and change his pancreatic function and have access to the insulin and his HPA, his hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, all those kind of stuff. There's plenty we can do, really.
But the idea of us not probably not having free will maybe at all, but having freer will is like if we're able to deal with our pain, let's say, from I guess your perspective, it's like if you've got chronic pain, and that's probably gonna have a massive impact on your life. Your life would be different without it. I'm sure everyone would agree with that. Therefore, it's like giving yourself freer will. It's still not free will, but it's like you're maybe able to do a couple of other things differently.
And then we were reading a little bit Noah Harari and the whole After Sapiens, the Homo Deus, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, the latest book, and the whole thing is talking about nowadays with all that artificial intelligence, social media, all the algorithms, all the silicon-based type algorithms. The main problem is people don't know themselves well enough, and the way of actually being in pain is very interesting because it helps you it can help you to understand who you are and how you function and what your algorithm is or algorithms are, in a way, really, and
so it can be an answer, it can be, like you say, like a communicator or an indicator to say like something's up, like,
you're alive, and maybe you're not fulfilling the path you need to fulfill, really, and there's a glitch, really, and the part of your body could be part of an answer and the start of an answer for you to understand a bit better who you are, how you function, and things, really. And so we talk about Piaget, which is a child psychologist, French, I think he's French. And he talks about the body being a bit of a theater for all those kind of things, really. So you tend to what we call with osteopathic like jargon or something like that, we talk about somatization a little bit, really.
You talk about
somatization. So you tend to, a thought is being stored in your body type thing and is expressing itself in your body type thing.
Yeah, you've spoken about this a few times.
That's it. So it becomes quite an interesting thing. And then in a lot, so there's archetypal part. So we talk about myth and things like that. So Carl Jung talks a lot about that, and he develops that to the nth level. It's so completely fabulous about the whole thing. But you look at your Greek mythology, and we were talking about Sisyphus, who's pushing his ball up the wall of the hill, and then he falls back down. And it pushes for eternity a little bit. So that that repetitive.
And why
thing.
Did he get that sentence again?
Because he was trying to. He was a bit narcissistic. I'm pretty sure, or something like that.
A grand.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. There was a bit of that, but there's Achilles and his heel, for example. So his map dips him in a Styx river, and he becomes invincible. Type thing. So we talk about having limitations a little bit. So that's a perfect example. He's quite limited, but as long as his secret, he is invincible. Until somebody hears about the Wolot and then gets a poisoned arrow, ping, and then he dies, really, basically, okay? So we people who might have Achilles tendinitis, they've got an inflammation of their Achilles tendon. Maybe they are reacting a pattern of behavior that would actually kind of be very well described with the myth of Achilles, and the fact that maybe somebody knows their little secret, or they think that somebody knows their little secret, or they feel like they're quite limited as well, a limitation type thing, really. So it becomes quite an interesting thing, different body parts in the scripture, there's a lot of that.
Is there like, I really like the idea of like, the myths having these like, or holding this thought, or the myths having something.
So it came out of the millions of years maybe, and the pattern of behavior.
The myth?
Is a pattern of behavior that once we were able to articulate it well enough to make it into a story that summarizes it quite nicely, really. I think that's my understanding of the myth, really, in a way. And your body is able to actually act in a metaphorical fashion what's happening into your mind. A little bit. So the pain you have is a metaphorical representation of a glitch in a pattern of behavior, which start to be a little bit interesting. But it's really fabulous. It's really excellent. And the expectation fulfillment theory of dream start to push it a bit further again, really, because there is definitely a neurophysiological effect, and your adrenal, and the fact that the ongoing inflammation in your Achilles tendon is actually why would you have inflammation just there, really? Well, you got two Achilles tendon, really. Yeah. So why isn't it on the other side?
Maybe there's too much weight on one side. It's like my foot on this side. What's?
Yeah. Maybe there's.
Is there a myth behind the issue of my foot?
It's very much possible. Very much possible.
And you find out what it is,
which eludes you a little bit. And then so we were listening to Jordan Peterson because we like his way of thinking and his way of actually articulating his thoughts, which is the grasp he has of the word as well, and logos. I think he really has very precise way of describing the whole stuff. And I've not listened too much yet about the Tower of Babel and what he thinks about the whole thing in terms of Genesis, and when he describes a bit the Old Testament and being part of that pattern of behavior a little bit. But my idea of it is we are building a tower. So again, he would talk about hierarchical. Thing, but we want to maybe God is not super magnanimous at the time, and he's really sending all the languages, and venture capsizes. Okay, but actually, isn't it a bit you want to reach a higher level of consciousness as an individual? In a way, you want to be able to use your brain. And you want to be able to be conscious of being conscious as much as possible. And the problem is pain. And pain is a language that you've forgotten about a little bit. And pain is hindering your ability to use your brain in full potential. So, and we know quite well, really, the headspace pain takes. A little bit, really. I ask you to do your accounts and I smash your big toe with a hammer. You're not going to do very good accounts, really, because you're becoming a big toe, really. Your big toe is going to take so much headspace, really. It's going to take so much headspace. It completely overwhelms you, really. And therefore, the main thing is to try to make your big toe as small as possible in order to be able to have access to the rest of your brain in order to do your accounts, really. Okay? For example, for just one simple task and a simple illustration, really. So we want to have access to a higher level of consciousness, which, left and right brain. So that's when we're going to talk a bit more about left and right brain at one stage, I'm sure. And that whole mentalist and mechanistic way of doing that, autistic or schizoid and psychotic tendencies, and the spectrum between the two, and the fact that some people maybe out there are able to use both their brain at the same time. And the main problem, when stressed, we fall into one brain and another. So like Joe Griffin and the whole human given is based on that, and an understanding of how is it you actually perceive reality a bit more with your right brain or a bit more with your left brain, especially when you're stressed, and the whole catextia, the context blindness that it leads to. The least context blind, the better, and maybe it enables you to reach a higher level of consciousness. That's the whole thing, really, because that's what we want to do, really. So,
do we?
Well, possibly more than going to buy the latest crabs that you
I
need
feel like
in
it
a
might
mall.
just be nice to be able to use this level of consciousness well.
But that's it.
That's on the journey to
That's it. But we are conscious of being conscious. So let's try to use as much of the potential as we can, and not be too... We're all a bit catextic, but it's not so much a problem of being catextic again, and it's not so much a problem of being in pain, it's not so much a problem about being stressed, it's a problem of managing the whole thing. And how is it, do you do it the same way than your peers have done before you? Right. Or do you try to learn a bit more from what has been coming your way over the last 40 million years, and you try to emulate that? So you were talking about religion by tradition and religion by knowledge. Do we want to try to enhance our ability to use our brain, or do we want to carry on doing the same that we've done before and not really think about, or possibly even regress a little bit? Because I think at one stage people were really using that. When people get really passionate about religious by tradition, there's like if someone attacks them, they become even their roots go even deeper. Of course, it's a belief thing, so you can't really change people's belief. At the end of the day, you want to challenge them, but you don't want to have to change them, because it's very unsettling for people to be able to have their belief challenged, and it's very stressful. That's the main thing. So I think it's as long as they are not coming to your house and killing you, I think they have the potential to actually believe what they believe, and the fact that we believe as well what we believe, so they could challenge your way of believing, really. And if their way of believing was resonating and helping you to grasp reality in a broader fashion and emulate that ability, why not follow their belief? In a way, really. And that's the problem with the flat earth people. Their belief is quite limited. That's the thing, it's quite simplistic and just perceptual type of thing. When actually, what is the humanistic thing we were talking about at one stage? What's good must be good, and what's bad must be bad. if it feels right, it must be right. If it feels good, it must be. If it feels bad, it must be bad. Well, maybe not. So the perception we have of things is quite limited. And yes, when you take your telescope and you look at, I don't know, like. What was I looking at? I was looking at the Coma Berenice and all the cluster of galaxies in Virgo. It takes you quite a fair distance away, really, and quite a fair bit back, really. So it's possibly 80 million light year away, really. So the light from that galaxy hits my retina through my telescope, and I'm aware of it, and I'm conscious of it, and it's been there, it's been traveling for 80 million years, and so it's quite a fair bit, really. The closest galaxy is 2 million light year away. So it took, when you look at it with your naked eye, because you can see Andromeda's galaxy with your naked eye, or maybe, anyway, the Triangulum would be the furthest away, but Andromeda in Tetbury, you can maybe see it with your naked eye or your averted night vision, and then it's 2 million years ago that the light that you received has been emitted. And 2 million years ago, we were not in the situation we're in now. That's it, really. And I was looking at a quasar in Ursa Major, and it's 4.5 billion light years away. So when the light has been emitted from the object, the sun was not even ignited. The solar system was not even created. So the ashes from the second generation of supernova had not even collapsed again to do the sun, really, and to create life, really. It was only the potential for it. The world had not been put together quite yet, really. So, yeah. But maybe that's just a belief, and maybe there's lots of quackery about the whole thing, really. I see it with my telescope, I take it with my camera, but maybe my camera there's a conspiracy, and maybe they put the image on my disc, really, in order to control me, really, in a way.
Probably what happened.
It's possibly what happened.
Yeah. Or maybe it's just something that plays on a big dome.
On a big dome, that's it.
Little things.
That's it, little things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So, except that there's supernovas, so not too long ago there was one in UCL, University College London. Some students were looking at M82, which is like in Ursa Major, and it's
which is in what?
Ursa Major, in a Big Dipper.
Okay.
The Bear, which is a very old constellation, because there's a cult of the bear in different places. In the Neolithic, that's another story, because we went into caves, and in caves there used to be bears. Anyway, that's another story. And that I took picture of that galaxy a couple of days before they found the supernova, and there was definitely no supernova on my image. And then I took the picture 3 days after they discovered it, because it was a clear night, and I compared the whole thing, and when you blink it, you can see the supernova in it. So, and it's I can't exactly remember the distance, but I think it's 20 million light year away, and so I missed the light had been emitted 20 million years ago minus 2 days. Okay, and I missed it, and it was not there yet. It was not here. It had not reached.
But you took a photo of it afterwards when it was there.
Yeah, what is there? Yeah. 3 days after. So it was 3 light days past Earth type thing, really. Okay, past the solar system, really. Okay.
That's so ridiculous.
So it's a bit mind-boggling, really, and that's the environment we're in, and rather than a dome, which a dome would be really, really great to have something really quite that simple. I'm not too sure who would make the mechanic go round, really, but
it's dark energy.
Dark energy.
Yeah, I'm not sure why the sun and the moon and
that's it, where it goes at night.
Maybe it's just one big LCD, flat screen.
So
screen.
It's called Nut. Nut is a Milky Way goddess in the Egyptian mythology, and there's a split in the Milky Way. just where Deneb, the main star from Cygnus, is one of the corner of the Summer Triangle. And in that area, that's the birth canal that used to be her vagisal type thing, and then she was giving birth of the sun just there, and she was swallowing it in her mouth, and she was giving birth to it a bit later. And then when the sun was setting, he was kind of traveling in the underworld at night to be reborn again every morning, basically. So the whole perceptual vision of the solar system and the wanderers as well, the planets. Planetos is the one who wanders. So, and that's why you've got Aries, Taurus, Sagittarius, Scorpio. You got all the zodiacal constellation is where the planets are wandering, basically. So they were quite of importance in a way. Okay. Historically, in myths, all those kind of things. Really, yeah.
Many people still
look at, well, if you get the chance to be able to look at them, it's you don't have to pay Sky or Netflix. It's outside, and if it's nice and dark, you go to a remote part of the outback, or you go even for us in Dartmoor or Exmoor or the Brecon and Beacons or the Scilly Isles, for example, just to name quite a few dark sky part in the UK. And you in a summer night and you moonless night, and you look at the Milky Way and the heavens lying on your back. It's pretty interesting. And again, we talk about pattern matching. So that whole gregarious part of your brain, the whole amygdala, is able to see, oh, look at the triangle. So there's triangle, squares, there's lions, there's Scorpios, there's things. And then you go to New Zealand, there's no lions. Because in New Zealand, there's no lions. So they can't really pattern match and look at the whole thing. Oh, a lion. Yeah. Oh, that's a lion. I think they only got kiwis and tuataras and dolphins and all those kind of things. So, and wood pigeon and piwaka wakas and all the fantail things. So they the whole way of the cosmogony is very different, really. So Matariki, the start of the year, when the heliacal rising of the Pleiades happens, is the start of their year, and then you got like, when is it we're gonna go seafaring? When is it we're gonna plant the sweet potatoes, the kumara? When is it we're gonna go hunting the wood pigeons? All those kind of stuff, and it's all written in the stars, and that whole thing. But there's no lion, there's no bears, there's no thing, because there's no mammals in New Zealand. There's only birds. That's it. Oh no, there's bats. Bats are the mammals in New Zealand. So that's the whole thing, really. They are not, their cosmogony is very different because their environment is very different, and they pattern match the whole thing in the sky as well, really. And it's that metaphorical representation of Leo, really, or the bear. Even the plow or the sickle of Leo is like it's as old as the world, really. That's the thing, and it's in the stars, really. And people talk about, so we call it in French Cheops, Kephren, Kerinos. I think you call it Khufu, and then the three pyramids in Giza,
yeah,
who are a bit like the Orion Belt. Type thing. So some people talk about the Orion Belt type thing, and some of the necropolis are being Betelgeuse and Rigel, and the four big main thing of the constellation of Orion, which is really, everybody should know a bit about Orion, and which one it is so
I think I know which one it is.
Staggering, really. But it's the pattern matching again. So you see it in the sky, and you see it's pretty extraordinary. And what do? Well, you do something extraordinary on the ground, which looks like what's in the sky.
So do you think when people were pattern matching, whether they're pattern matching from the skies or whatever to create stories to maybe help their communities or whatever, then potentially help their communities flow and work well together, blah blah blah. You've spoken about Egyptian history before. Do you think they consciously knew what they were doing?
A minority of people would have known very well indeed, and would have tried Because the main thing to try to reach a higher level of consciousness or to look at the sky day in, day out, well, you need to eat still. So you need somebody who feeds you. That's the thing, really.
Not going to be spending time deciphering out.
And the hierarchical place where the pharaoh, or maybe even more than the pharaoh on that pyramid is, well, at the base we need a base, and the base is really broad. We don't build pyramids like that. They don't stand very long, really. Yeah. We build pyramids like that, and the base is really broad. And maybe the agriculturalist, the one who works the soil and the earth, are the one we need the most of. And we don't need 100,000 pharaohs. We just maybe need one. And that whole pyramidal representation is, so Jordan Peterson talks a lot about that, about those kind of stuff. Is the representation of the world and the one big lobster. There's only one big lobster, and it's a plethora of not that big lobsters, so we can get a pyramid.
But that's it's like that's kind of tricky to talk about in some ways because that's not fair on other people. It's like I not.
Yeah.
Not like it's not fair having a hierarchy, right?
But not everybody can be the pharaoh, and not everybody can be a peasant. Not everybody can. That's the thing, really. And the main thing at the time, there was no concept of fairness, because there was no need of a concept of fairness. Because as a peasant, if you were able to fulfill your destiny a little bit, you had access to the same place than the pharaoh.
Yeah.
That's the thing, really.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And you've got a certain potential that you're able to fulfill, and that's the whole stuff. You don't try to be who you're not. Try to be who you are, and try to know yourself a bit better. Really, that's what the message is, really. Yeah. And that fairness thing is a lunacy. It's lunacy.
Yeah.
It's not fair.
Yeah.
And we cannot do everything that has been tried to make society and life fairer has failed.
Yeah.
And dramatically.
Made the interests even more pronounced.
Even more pronounced. So we were talking about that little talk about the Scandinavian countries, where actually we try to make to give people the same opportunities, and there is even more discrepancy in between people.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that the state is trying to mitigate the difference between people and try to even things out even more. And it's not really happening. People are not the same, and we all are different, and we all need to fulfill our potential, and we've got different potential. We need to read a bit more Rumi, and we need to be a little bit more humble about the whole lot. Rumi is a Sufi philosopher, and it's really very interesting. Some people have a potential that is really small. That's it. Up. It's fulfilled. I'm fulfilled. And other people, they got a bottomless pit to fulfill. And it's not very easy, really. And you can put bucket loads of it.
It's often those people that end up in a really bad physical and mental state.
Maybe, but maybe because they don't know that it's a bottomless one. If they knew, if they accepted it, I don't think it's a problem. It's Buddha. Buddha is he suffers. He does all sorts of things to try to find the Schmilblick or whatever he calls it, and up until he realizes he's just there. He doesn't have to. You don't have to toil. Yeah, a bit. You need to toil before and suffer a little bit in order to be a bit more cool about the whole stuff, really. But that pattern of behavior, that algorithm, is the way it is, and maybe knowledge is enabling you to actually analyze it, and being conscious or being conscious is helping you to analyze it. And if you want to change it, well, good on you. There's no problem. You're going to change it to another algorithm anyway. You're going to fall in another loop again, and that loop is going to be unknown. A little bit, really. You're not going to have controlled it. You're not going to have mastered the whole lot. You're going to fall on another one, which might actually not end up giving you what you intended to give you. And then you're going to not be very happy, and you might suffer again. And you're going to have to re-observe it instead of looking at the whole algorithm that there is and the hand you've been given, really. And yes, well, that's the hand I've been given. And I know which hand I've been given, and I know my limitations. And once you know your limitation, and you've explored quite a fair bit, really, and it might take a lifelong, really. The sooner it is, you find out, the better, maybe. But I think it's maybe quite a good thing to do, really. And buying a bigger car to be safer, why don't you maybe take a bit of advanced driving test, really? Go to Castle Combe, and then maybe you're going to be safer in your old banger, really, because it's your driving, it's not the car. We get a bit mixed up about things, really. It's just the perspective.
And then not all the emotional needs are like, obviously not all the emotional needs are equal, because it's like with the
ego-based needs.
Yeah, I mean, some obviously pertain to different parts of us being us, like the ego and stuff, but it's like you're talking about spending your life or spending a long time trying to get some balance, but it's like that balance doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have everything like career-wise, which everyone, a lot of people focus on, which is very much status, attention, control, and safety, security. Yeah. It's like maybe you don't actually need to have that figured out, maybe even at all.
That's it.
For a long part of your life.
And it's what you were saying earlier on, the expectation you have of it now, by the time you figure it out, is going to have changed anyway.
Yeah,
that's the thing, really.
Like the bullet where it's like, oh, it's all here. Because,
that's it.
Because the status and control, it's like, well, I never had any of that, so now I'm in the same situation.
Spinning plates. We're spinning plates all the time. Yeah. That's the whole thing, really. But you know how many plates you spin. So if there's just 10 plates to spin, just stick to 10 plates. It's pretty good already. It's already quite difficult, really. Yeah. And from one to another, any decision you make, are you able to not make them in a too emotional fashion? Are you able to be a bit calmer when making decisions? Isn't it great when you're having an argument with your girlfriend or your partner or your spouse to be a bit like, well, shall we talk about that tomorrow? Let's not finish the discussion now, but let's talk about it tomorrow. Let's sleep on it. There'll be quite a lot that's going to come out of it, and then maybe tomorrow we can, I need to apologize for that, because I was not, I was a bit harsh on the whole lot, and then actually that's what I meant, and then you start to be able to, and maybe have another argument again, and having to sleep on it again, and things like that. Really.
Or walk it off for a bit, or do whatever.
Walking off, and things like that, exactly. And de-arouse yourself a little bit. Going outside having a cigarette is maybe not the way to actually do it. You might need to have a couple of hours for the whole thing to go down, and you need to really not think about the whole thing too much and rehearse it in your head, really. You need to be able to think about something else,
keep
really.
That level of emotional arousal. Or even arouse yourself even
that's it.
And everyone's we've all been there where we've had the arguments, and she's going to say this, and then I'm going to say that, and then I'm going to get her with this.
That's it. It doesn't solve problems very well, really. But we're all guilty of that at the end of the day, and that's the beauty of it, really, and it's to be able to recognize it and to be a bit humble about it. At the end of the day, there's no perfect situation, really. Perfection it's just something you aspire to. I think in mathematics they call that asymptotic. Asymptote. So that's the whole, it gets towards the curve, but it doesn't really
tending towards.
That's it. Asymptotic. No, so osteopathy, lots of interesting things. But the great thing is that it's enabling you to the broader your view of the world, the more all-encompassing you can be, and the more pain becomes a very interesting and very mysterious and a very intriguing and a very I don't know, I think it's fabulous. Helpful potentially thing, really. It wasn't a complete dead end, just to talk about pain. That's it, really. A depression could be a very interesting thing. That thing, really. A chronic fatigue could be a very interesting thing.
I think people are already looking at it that way. Like I said, the girl I spoke to literally just before coming here, she's already like, I already look at it that way. I already understand that it's quite an interesting thing, and it's a big journey that I've been on, and I'm going to continue being on that journey.
As long as your journey is fine. If you want to be static, those kind of things completely stifle you, and that's it.
Take over,
yeah. I think you turn into stone. I think is the gorgon.
Going back to
the medusa type stuff.
Cool. Should we end
Cool.
it there?
Yeah, we can. Well done.